South Africa has a shared history with its next-door neighbor, Zimbabwe, and has become the first port of call for the many people trying to escape the political and economic meltdown of what was once the breadbasket of Africa. This has led to a situation where an estimated 1 to 2 million Zimbabweans are living illegally in South Africa. With no system of regulation, nobody knows the true numbers.
The question has always been there, whether South Africa has got any leverage on the political processes in Zimbabwe, whether it's powerless, and if it's powerless, why it should therefore be a victim of these huge volumes of movement of people into its country when it has no control or leverage over the political processes in Zimbabwe.
The movement of large numbers of refugees and economic migrants is directly linked to the political processes in Zimbabwe. And while instability continues, South Africa will continue to take the strain, while at the same time having very little to offer those who come here in desperation.
Guard us by your love, and in your wisdom keep us in eternal life.
Let us pray. O Lord, giver of life and salvation, bless this oil for the healing of the sick.
What we started discovering over here is that every time a crisis of health or a political crisis like the votes or whatever else, our numbers would swell. Last year we had a woman who was picked up, I think it's by the Magamagamas. She was raped by 10 different men. She arrived back here and her husband said to me, you know, when I saw her, even though she was alive, her eyes were completely dead. I had a young man over here. He had been confronted by the Metro Police outside for his documentation. He gave them his asylum papers. They tore the asylum papers up, made him lie down on the ground, searched him, pulled a gun on him, and eventually he came up here. They'd come from a place of being traumatized, and they'd been traumatized on the streets of Johannesburg.
The spirit of Ubuntu itself will say if your brother or sister is dying, if your sister is being raped, you have an obligation to protect that. If your neighbor's its house is on fire, you have an obligation to assist in quenching the fire, to put out the fire.
Firearms, knives, drugs.
African non-nationals have been all too frequently accused of driving up the crime rate by popular media and by South African communities. This has led to police crackdowns in an attempt to reassure the public that something is being done about crime. In 2008, the nation's hostility to foreigners reached a peak. Zimbabweans became a key target and many were chased out of their homes. Some lost their lives as poor South Africans fought other Africans for resources. This violence and hostility continues today. Yet despite the violence, Zimbabweans, desperate to escape poverty and political harassment, have continued to arrive daily in South Africa in search of refuge.
Because of the spectacular collapse that took place in Zimbabwe and the resultant consequence of forced migration of people outside Zimbabwe, the system in South Africa and the system in Zimbabwe was such that it was not possible for the human movement to be controlled in a manner where South Africa remains in control of facts and figures.
By 2010, the situation had become untenable, and the South African government, through the Department of Home Affairs, did something some say was long overdue. They extended the provisions of the Immigration Act to offer an opportunity for undocumented Zimbabweans to regularize their immigration status.
The South African government has come to terms with the reality of the situation. The truth is we have quite a number of Zimbabweans that have come to the country, not necessarily because they were persecuted. A whole of them are what you call economic refugees, but they're there. So this process is trying to look at what of those people can, using the discretion of the Minister of Home Affairs, be documented and regularized.
This documentation is important because it's the base for the self-reliance of a family. With no documentation, things are very simple. Your children is not going to school, you don't access healthcare, you don't access a job, you don't access a driving license, life is impossible. It's the basic thing of renting a house, you need a documentation. So it's very fundamental for local integration or for self-reliance.
Initially, Lawyers for Human Rights were very excited about the announcement that the government was going to grant a special regime or special permit to Zimbabweans in South Africa. Because for a long time we've seen large numbers of Zimbabweans left without any formal documentation permitting their stay in South Africa, and that left them vulnerable to constant arrest and deportation to Zimbabwe.
Undocumented Zimbabweans who fulfill the criteria could now apply for permits to work, study, and own businesses and make a vital contribution to the economy, as many already do. Once they were documented, they could get access to basic state services such as healthcare.
What South Africa did in documenting Zimbabweans in South Africa was a very important step. It actually went beyond what is required by international conventions, the Constitution, and even SADC protocols. But it was a pragmatic way to deal with immigration, and it was also a compassionate way to deal with the situation. Ultimately, the government's approach was you do need everyone in your country documented for various reasons, for security reasons, but also for your ability to be able to provide services for everyone. And if you don't know how many people you have as a country, then you have a problem in terms of planning your services and planning and also dealing with security requirements of the country.
Before people were documented, they would find it very difficult to move around on the streets. I often say that we used to live like moles. Whenever the sun comes up, we go underground because the sun shines too bright. It simply means that we were playing hide and seek with the law enforcement agencies in this country. The advantages of this project, in my opinion, is that it saves us from the indignities and the exploitation that a lot of us have suffered in this country under the hands of very unscrupulous employers. So it protects us in that if you are documented, you have a work permit, you can easily go and report an unscrupulous employer.
The fact that everybody is documented will allow people to join the union, to join the formal mechanism of labor entities or structure, so that together both foreigners and South African will basically unite to maintain the best favorable wages for all. The fact that they are not documented, at the opposite, increase and encourage black market exploitation of the human beings. That's why we believe that the document process has far-reaching impact, both in Zimbabwe and inside South Africa. And I believe for South Africa the benefits are enormous if well conducted.
To be regularized, it means that we have the security. You know, if we have the right papers that allow us to live and work in South Africa, we are able to work, you know, knowing that at least after such and such a time, I'll still be here, so I can plan knowing that if my permit is going to expire maybe after 4 years or 3 years or something like that, I will know that I can plan for those 3 years ahead. Unlike previously, without any documentation, you're always living like, on the run. There is no long-term plan, it's always short-term.
It's also important for South Africans to understand that South Africa is signed up to and ratified a number of international instruments. So there is international responsibility as a responsible international citizen that is expected of South Africa. And when you look at the South African Constitution, you look at the South African laws around migration, around refugees, around relations generally, those laws are all consistent with international commitments that South Africa has signed in terms of international law. It's important for humanity, it's important for global peace, it's important for regional peace.
To document over 1 million people, Home Affairs would have to ensure that careful planning and adequate resources will be put in place to show the state's commitment to tackling the problem.
Our excitement soon came to an end when we were told that Zimbabweans only had 3 months to apply for these permits, and we realized that it was not enough, and the categories for which Zimbabweans could apply would only cater for a minority of the broader Zimbabwean population.
The rules of who can qualify for these special permits have also been criticized. To qualify, you must have a valid Zimbabwean passport and prove you have a job in South Africa. This excludes some of the most vulnerable people, including people with disabilities who are unlikely to be in formal employment.
You can come inside here. This is my room. This one. This is my room where I'm staying. I've got 2 children and 1 wife. And 1 sister.
One of the key requirements was a passport, a Zimbabwean passport, which some didn't have, or if they had had it many years ago, it had expired. So they needed to go through a whole lot of processes within the Zimbabwean state to get the passport, to then apply to the South African process. So what seemed to be a problem was that there hadn't been a consideration that if you're looking at capacity to take care of the administration that was required, you needed to look at not just the capacity of the South African state, you also needed to look at the capacity of the Zimbabwean government.
Basically, most of the people that are here, most of the Zimbabweans came here through border jumping at the height of this economic and political problems back home in Zimbabwe. So that's why most of the people didn't have the documents, the right documents, the passports and Zim IDs.
Home Affairs has been criticized for setting unrealistic deadlines. 3 months would not be enough time to complete the application process. Many missed the 31st of December deadline simply because they could not get hold of documents from Zimbabwe on time.
They changed the requirements halfway through the process, but here in this village we didn't know about it. We only got to know about it just a week before the closing date. So most of the people who could have gotten the chance to register didn't get the chance to register because there wasn't much time.
A further criticism of Home Affairs has been the lack of capacity of frontline officers and staff to manage the documentation process. Poorly trained officers, poor communication, and too few counters led to long queues and frustration as people scrambled to get registered.
Towards December, they were saying that around 250,000 people had applied in response to the amnesty policy. and the estimations by government, because the government does not know how many Zimbabweans are here. They were saying you have anything between 1.5 million and 2.5 million Zimbabweans. Some give to 3 million Zimbabweans. So if you have a policy to document Zimbabweans, if that's the idea, to say the end game is documentation of Zimbabweans, and you say there are 1.5 to 2.5 million of them, and you only get a response of 275,000, that in itself, in terms of just looking at figures, means that the policy has failed.
Many people who come to this country, because the suspicion is that this country, as negotiator, is also in the pockets of the ZANU-PF. They're very, very suspicious that, having been abused by allies of ZANU-PF or by ZANU-PF themselves, then to come into a system that is so closely aligned with ZANU-PF, they're actually endangering themselves. They're, in actual fact, as it were, giving themselves up into the hands of the enemy.
The 3 months came and went, and we suspect that the department will start with their deportations again in August, where many thousands of Zimbabweans will again be deported to Zimbabwe. And so I'm afraid, despite our initial excitement, this project did not deliver to its original promises.
So if the policy fails, what are the implications? That's the issue now, because which means you are back to square one. You have a predominantly large section of Zimbabwean community who are not documented. What happened before, when they were not documented and there was a policy of deportation, I think in 2008 to 2009, the general understanding is that deportations came to about 200 to 300,000 Zimbabweans for that period. And in 2007, the understanding was that there were about 17,000 deportations per day. But with huge deportations such as this, did you get a reduction in the number of Zimbabweans in South Africa? The answer is no. Why? Which means the deportations were not effective. Zimbabweans were coming straight back as soon as they were deported.
Towards the end of November, we realized that a lot of people are not going to benefit from it, and the department refused to listen to our concerns that many people will be excluded from it. And eventually, we had no choice but to approach the public protector, who I must say immediately reacted to our request, and she facilitated a discussion with the Director General of the Department of Home Affairs, where we had the opportunity to inform him of our concerns and our fears that the project will fall short. Sadly, that project or that initiative by the public protector did not then change anything, and the department insisted that the deadline was to be the 31st of December.
In knowing human beings, I actually accepted a Home Affairs' approach, which was go with the deadline of the 31st and make sure that people are compelled to try and meet this deadline, and then see how many can really meet the deadline, and then look at what is the excess and address that. Because people tend to go on the last day. If they had extended the deadline, people would have still gone there on the new deadline. But the idea was this was a soft deadline, like a public deadline, but internally, after this, everything is going to be reviewed. One of the undertakings from the Department of Home Affairs was that nobody was going to be arrested or deported, and whilst we're assessing whether they applied or didn't, there would be no deportations until we have evaluated. And then once we have evaluated, then and seen that everything was done as required, then the matter will be taken forward.
Continued reports of police harassment suggest that the message about amnesty was not clearly communicated.
At the policy level, there's a desire to give amnesty. But at the operational level, there's no clear understanding of what that policy decision, how it has to be implemented, and what objectives have to be achieved.
You will always have problems with immigrants from Zimbabwe and other countries if you don't confront the problems as they are. And the root cause of the problem in Zimbabwe is bad governance. The root cause of the problem in Zimbabwe is the refusal to accept electoral defeat by the incumbent when he's defeated, which happened in 2008 when then President Mugabe launched a one-man electoral campaign and stood against himself, something that we have never seen before, and he declared himself a winner. So the root cause is bad governance, is refusal to step down of the incumbent. We need South Africa to deal with those problems, and South Africa should assist us who are in this country and others who are in the diaspora in Botswana, for example, to be able to vote so that when the time comes after the elections, we can be asked, why did you again retain Mugabe and yet you continue to refuse to go back to Mugabe? If we retain Mugabe in the next election, then that's it, but the diaspora should be allowed to vote.
South Africa does have leverage on the political processes in Zimbabwe. It's the single country that has got the greatest capacity and maybe a potential say on how the Zimbabwean crisis can be resolved. Mugabe was pushing for an election before June 2011, and because he says that this inclusive government with Changira is not working. And to show South Africa's power, Zuma then said, no, we are going to come up with a roadmap of what things need to be done before Zimbabwe can be ready for an election whose outcome cannot be contested. That's where you see the leverage of South Africa, and I think the leadership of President Zuma, when he then comes up and says, we need a proper roadmap that will result in the creation of conditions that allow for Zimbabweans to be given an effective voice in the elections. That is leverage and that is leadership. And that's what South Africa has the potential to do.
The move to regulate undocumented Zimbabweans in South Africa has been relatively unsuccessful to date. Yet the crisis that brings thousands into the country will not go away. The South African government lifted the moratorium on the deportation of undocumented Zimbabweans in October 2011. Since then, the number of deportations to Zimbabwe have gradually increased. A number of civil society organizations have raised concern over the deportation of unaccompanied children.
Until the Zimbabwean crisis is genuinely resolved and the Zimbabweans are given an opportunity to go through an election which is real, where they are allowed to choose leaders of their choice without violence, without being subjected to abuse, that crisis will remain there. The refugees will continue coming to South Africa, and that's the bottom line.